At 9:42 a.m. on July 13, 1944, Sergeant Curtis "Grub" Cullen stood rigidly near the town of St. Lo, his eyes fixed on General Omar Bradley as the senior officer stepped out of a dust-covered jeep. In that moment, Cullen's palms were sweaty, his mind racing. He knew the next 30 seconds would seal the fate of 3,000 American tanks poised to break through Normandy's brutal hedgerow country, a terrain that had turned the Allied advance into a bloody slog. At 29 years old, Cullen had poured 2 weeks of relentless work into refining his makeshift device, a contraption cobbled together without a single ounce of official approval from high command. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Over the previous 6 weeks, the U.S. First Army had lost more than 400 Sherman tanks in their futile attempts to cross Normandy's so-called hedgerows. But these were no ordinary hedges. They were ancient, impenetrable earthen walls, standing 12 feet tall and 4 feet thick, reinforced by centuries of tangled root growth that had turned them into natural fortresses. For generations of French farmers, dating back to medieval times, these barriers had begun as simple stone piles marking property lines. Over centuries, dirt accumulated between the stones, trees took root in the crevices, and what started as humble boundaries evolved into unyielding obstacles that now threatened to derail the entire Normandy campaign. When American tank crews attempted to climb these age-old barriers, they unwittingly exposed the fatal flaw of their Sherman tanks, the thin 1-inch armor plating on their bellies. This vulnerability was a death sentence. German Panzerfaust teams, elite anti-tank units armed with portable rocket launchers, and skilled anti-tank gunners zeroed in on this weak spot with ruthless precision, their rounds piercing the thin metal like a hot knife through butter. The result was catastrophic. Most Sherman crews were incinerated alive inside their burning tanks before they could even reach the hatches to bail out. Cullen's unit, the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron of the 2nd Armored Division, had been tasked with probing these deadly hedgerows since June 20th, and the math of the campaign was grimly straightforward, a brutal equation of life and death. Each infantry battalion was equipped with approximately 70 tanks, and High Command had allocated just 4 M4 dozer tanks, Shermans fitted with bulldozer blades, per battalion to clear paths through the hedges. While these dozer tanks could technically push through the earthen walls, they were painfully slow, lumbering targets that immediately drew the full attention of German gunners. As a result, they were quickly picked off, making them all but useless for the large-scale rapid advances needed to break the stalemate. Between D-Day, June 6th, and July 10th, a full month after the Allied invasion began, American forces had managed to advance a mere 8 miles inland, a glacial pace that filled command with dread. Stretching out before them, between the hard-won beachhead and the open French countryside beyond, were thousands of hedgerow-lined fields, each one a potential death trap. At the current rate of advance, military planners calculated that the First Army would need a full 6 months to cover just 20 miles, far too slow to keep the momentum of the invasion alive. Cullen, however, refused to accept that the hedgerows were an unbeatable obstacle. He found his inspiration in the most unlikely of places: discarded German beach obstacles known as Czech hedgehogs. These formidable barriers, made by welding 3 heavy railway iron beams into a jagged jack shape, had been planted by the thousands on Normandy's invasion beaches to tear apart Allied landing craft and halt the invasion before it even began. But the Americans had adapted. Army engineers had cut these obstacles apart with acetylene torches and stockpiled the sturdy steel beams, seeing potential in the enemy's own defenses. Cullen, drawing on his modest background in mechanical work and a soldier's instinct for practicality, saw a way to turn this scrap metal into a weapon of survival. Over 3 grueling days, working in a makeshift field workshop amid the chaos of war, he took 4 sections of hedgehog steel, each piece 2 inches thick, strong enough to withstand heavy impacts, and welded them to the bow plate of a light tank. He angled the prongs 35 degrees forward, a critical design choice. Instead of climbing over the hedgerows and exposing the tank's belly, the prongs would dig into the base of the earthen wall, allowing the tank to push through from ground level, keeping its vulnerable underbelly protected at all times. Cullen tested the device 7 times on the light tank, and each test was a success: 7 clean, effective breaches of the hedgerows. When Major Sidney Bingham of the 2nd Armored Division heard about the tests, he ordered a more rigorous trial, fitting the device to a full-weight 33-ton Sherman tank more than double the light tank's 15-ton weight. The increased heft meant higher impact force, which could rip the prongs off the bow plate or even flip the tank forward. Undaunted, Lieutenant Charles Green of the 747th Tank Battalion volunteered his crew and his Sherman for the risky test. They welded the 320-pound four-prong assembly to Green's tank on July 11th, and over the next 2 days they conducted 5 more test runs, each one a success. The prongs held firm, the tank remained stable, and the hedgerows were breached with ease. Word of Cullen's invention quickly made its way up the chain of command to Bradley's headquarters, and the general wasted no time. He ordered a personal demonstration for July 13th, a make-or-break moment for the device and for the entire Normandy campaign. As the demonstration got underway, Bradley pointed to a towering 12-foot-tall hedgerow 200 yards away, the exact same type of barrier that had halted American armor for 42 long days, claiming hundreds of lives and countless tanks. Green climbed into his commander's hatch, his face set with determination, while his gunner, Sergeant Frank Weber, sealed the turret tight, checking and rechecking the locks to ensure it wouldn't jolt open during the impact. The driver, his hands gripping the steering wheel, revved the Sherman's engine, the deep roar echoing across the Norman field. Cullen stood just a few feet from Bradley, his heart pounding in his chest, acutely aware that every eye was on the tank and the device he'd built with his own hands. The Sherman rumbled forward, positioning itself 50 yards from the target hedgerow, a distance calculated to give it enough time to build up maximum speed. Over the radio, Green's voice crackled clearly. "Ready to demonstrate hedgerow breach, sir." Bradley, his face impassive but his eyes sharp, raised his binoculars to his eyes and gave the order. "Proceed." The Sherman lurched forward, accelerating steadily until it reached 25 miles per hour, its tracks churning up dirt and gravel as it bore down on the earthen wall. The 4 steel prongs slammed into the hedgerow with a deafening crash, a sound like 2 freight trains colliding head-on. Dirt and small stones exploded upward in a cloud, obscuring the tank from view. For 3 agonizing seconds, seconds that felt like an eternity to Cullen and Bradley, the Sherman seemed to stall, its engine roaring as it pushed against 500 years of compacted earth and tangled roots. Then suddenly the prongs bit through the base of the wall, the hedgerow collapsed inward in a shower of dirt and roots, and the Sherman burst through to the other side in just 14 seconds, emerging unscathed, its prongs still intact. Bradley lowered his binoculars, a rare flicker of relief and approval crossing his face. He walked slowly to the gaping hole in the hedgerow, his boots crunching on the broken earth and severed roots, and reached out to touch the torn earthen wall, as if confirming with his own hands that the impossible had just happened. Turning to Major General Leonard Jarrow, his chief of staff, Bradley's voice was calm but urgent. "How many of these can we produce?" Jarrow, who had also watched the demonstration with intense focus, turned to Cullen, who had followed close behind. Cullen took a deep breath, knowing his answer would shape the future of the campaign. "Sir, the stockpiled beach obstacles provide enough steel for approximately 500 devices." Bradley didn't hesitate, his tone leaving no room for debate. "I want 3,000. We need every tank in First Army fitted with these prongs before Operation Cobra launches." The order was clear, the task Herculean, but for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope that the hedgerow deadlock could be broken. Captain James Doherty, a no-nonsense ordnance officer with a reputation for getting things done, arrived at the designated production site near the town of Colombelle on July 14th, leading a contingent of 30 skilled welders and 6 cutting torch rigs. He lost no time in setting up a streamlined production process, laying out the steps clearly on a field table covered with maps and hand-drawn diagrams. First, cut the hedgehog steel beams into 4-foot sections. Next, grind the edges of each section to sharp points to maximize penetration. Then, weld the sharpened sections to heavy steel mounting plates. And finally, bolt the completed assemblies to the bow plates of the waiting Shermans. In theory, each installation would take 4 hours, a tight schedule, but manageable. In practice, however, nothing went as planned. The German hedgehog steel, forged to withstand the rigors of coastal defense, was far harder than standard American construction-grade steel, and the cutting torches struggled to slice through it. After just 20 minutes of continuous use, the torch tips overheated, glowing red-hot and becoming useless until they cooled down, a critical delay that brought production to a near standstill. By the end of the first day, the team had completed just 8 devices, barely a fraction of the 3,000 needed. At that pitiful rate, Doherty calculated, it would take until October to modify all the tanks. Well after Operation Cobra was supposed to have launched, and likely after the German army had reinforced its hedgerow defenses beyond all hope of breaking. Cullen, refusing to let his invention fail due to production delays, spent the entire day of July 15th troubleshooting the production line, moving from one welding station to the next, observing the process, asking questions, and studying the problems firsthand. He quickly identified the root cause of the slowdown: heat buildup in the torch tips, a result of the dense German steel absorbing thermal energy far slower than American steel, which meant the torches had to work harder and longer to make cuts. Determined to find a solution, Cullen contacted the First Army's engineering depot, requisitioning dozens of additional torch assemblies to replace the overheated ones. He also reorganized the welders into rotation shifts, a simple but effective fix. One team would work with the torches until they overheated, then step aside to let their equipment cool, while a second team took over with fresh torches. This way, production never stopped. The changes worked. By the end of July 15th, production had risen to 22 devices, but even that was still far from enough to meet the 3,000 target. Doherty, recognizing the urgency, reached out to maintenance battalions across Normandy, begging for additional welders. He managed to secure 40 more skilled men, who arrived within 48 hours, and by July 17th, daily output had climbed to 38 devices. Even so, the math remained brutal and unforgiving. 3,000 tanks divided by 38 devices per day meant it would take 79 days to complete the modifications, far longer than the 8 days left until Operation Cobra's scheduled launch. The clock was ticking, and every passing hour brought the Allied campaign closer to disaster. As production slowly ramped up, a new and potentially fatal problem emerged during the welding process. The 320-pound four-prong assembly, when bolted directly to the Sherman's bow plate, shifted the tank's center of gravity forward by 6 inches. This extra weight at the front caused the tank's suspension to compress, putting enormous strain on the front springs. When test tanks were run through repeated hedgerow breaches, mimicking the conditions they would face in combat, several of the suspension springs developed dangerous stress fractures. Cullen knew this was a critical flaw. If a spring failed in the middle of a battle, the tank would be immobilized, its front end broken, leaving the crew trapped and defenseless in the open, exposed to German gunfire. Refusing to let this setback derail the project, Cullen went back to the drawing board, working late into the night in his makeshift workshop to redesign the mounting system. His solution was elegant and practical. Instead of bolting the prongs directly to the bow plate, he added a set of heavy reinforcement brackets that distributed the weight of the prongs across the entire front of the tank's hull, spreading the load and relieving the stress on the suspension. The modification added 30 minutes to each installation, a minor delay in the grand scheme of things, but it completely eliminated the risk of suspension failure. By July 19th, just 6 days before Operation Cobra was set to launch, daily production had climbed to 64 devices, and the Ordnance Group had completed roughly 400 modifications. But 2,600 tanks still needed to be fitted with the prongs, and Bradley's staff sent a frantic priority message to the production site. The general required a minimum of 2,000 modified Rhino tanks, as the prongs-equipped Shermans had come to be called, for the offensive. A delay in Cobra, the message warned, would give the German army time to reinforce its hedgerow defenses with additional troops, tanks, and artillery, costing thousands of American lives and potentially dooming the breakout before it even began. By July 22nd, just 3 days before Operation Cobra was set to launch, production had hit 1,200 devices. Doherty, crunching the numbers late into the night, calculated that if the team kept up the current pace, they could install another 850 prongs before the offensive began, bringing the total to 2,050 Rhino tanks, just above Bradley's minimum requirement of 2,000. For the first time in weeks, there was a sense of cautious optimism at the production site, but that optimism was short-lived. On the morning of July 22nd, the steel ran out. Every last German beach obstacle between the Allied beachhead and Cherbourg had been processed, cut into sections, and welded into prongs. Engineers scoured the area and managed to find approximately 300 more Czech hedgehogs scattered along minor beach exits, but transportation units were stretched to the breaking point. tasked with moving critical ammunition and fuel supplies for Operation Cobra. There was no way to get the additional obstacles to the production site in time. Doherty, facing yet another crisis, began to explore alternative materials. He remembered hearing reports that some tank units had experimented with using railroad tracks as a substitute for steel. Tracks were abundant across Normandy, left behind by the German army or part of the local French railway system. While railroad track steel was softer than the German hedgehog steel and not as durable, it was readily available in large quantities. Several units, including Lieutenant Green's 747th Tank Battalion, had already built their own makeshift prongs using massive railroad ties, a design they called the Green Dozer. These railroad prongs were heavier and cruder than Cullen's original design, but they had proven effective in testing. With no other options, Doherty made the call to shift to a hybrid production model. Units that still had access to German hedgehog steel would get Cullen's original design, while everyone else would receive the railroad prong variant. It wasn't ideal, but it was the only way to reach Bradley's minimum target. On July 23, 2 days before Operation Cobra, production reached 1,800 devices, with 500 more in progress using railroad steel. The final estimate, after accounting for all available materials and the remaining time, was 2,300 Rhino tanks, 77% of Bradley's total armor. It wasn't the 3,000 he had demanded, and it wasn't perfect, but it was enough to launch the offensive. On July 24th, the day before Cobra, the modified tanks began moving in massive convoys to forward assembly areas near the town of Marigny. Cullen, who hadn't slept in 72 hours and whose hands were covered in small burns from handling hot metal, walked slowly through the staging zones, watching column after column of Shermans roll past. Each tank carried 4 steel prongs on its bow, a strange, jagged addition that made them look like prehistoric beasts, dinosaurs equipped for battle. Operation Cobra was set to begin at dawn on July 25th, with a massive air bombardment. 3,000 Allied aircraft would drop 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions, softening up the defenses before the tanks advanced. Then the Rhino tanks would lead the charge through the hedgerow terrain, using Cullen's prongs to breach the barriers the Germans thought were impregnable. As Cullen stood in the field, watching the tanks assemble, he felt a profound sense of awe and responsibility. Those steel prongs, he realized, represented 14,000 men, tank crews, infantrymen, and support troops, who might now survive the breakout. 14,000 soldiers who wouldn't burn to death in their tanks, exposing their bellies to German guns. Whether the devices actually worked in the chaos of combat, whether his invention would live up to its promise, would be determined in approximately 9 hours. As the sun set on July 24th, casting a golden glow over the rows of tanks, Cullen leaned against a jeep, exhausted but hopeful. The moment of truth was almost here. At 6:11 a.m. on July 25th, the quiet of the Norman dawn was shattered as 1,500 Allied bombers roared overhead, unleashing a devastating barrage of 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions near St. Lo. Cullen watched from a forward observation post 3 miles behind the start line, the ground shaking violently beneath his feet as the bombs exploded, sending plumes of smoke and dirt high into the sky. The bombardment lasted 90 long minutes, a relentless onslaught that drowned out all other sounds. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was eerie and unnatural, as if the world itself was holding its breath. At 7:45 a.m., the order to advance was given, and the first Rhino tanks rumbled forward, crossing into the deadly hedgerow terrain. The 2nd Armored Division led the assault, their Shermans moving in tight formation, followed closely by the 3rd Armored Division. The 1st Infantry Division, known as the Big Red One, provided support, their infantrymen advancing alongside the tanks to protect them from German infantry attacks. Every tank in the assault force was equipped with either Cullen's original hedgehog prongs or the railroad variant, each one a testament to the ingenuity and hard work of the ordnance teams who had built them in record time. Cullen gripped his binoculars tightly, his eyes fixed on the first wave of tanks, his heart in his throat. This was the moment he had worked for, the moment that would decide if his invention was a success or a failure. Radio reports began pouring in at 8:15 a.m., their urgency and excitement cutting through the static. Company B of the 2nd Armored Division had reached its first hedgerow objective, and the lead Sherman had accelerated to 25 miles per hour, slammed into the earthen wall, and pushed through in just 16 seconds. The crew reported no damage to the prongs or the tank's suspension. Perfect success. More reports followed in rapid succession, each one bringing good news. Company C had breached 3 hedgerows in 20 minutes, moving faster than any Allied unit had since D-Day. Company A had pushed through 5 consecutive hedge lines without stopping, their tanks emerging unscathed on the other side. Across the entire assault front, the pattern was the same. Tanks that had once taken hours to advance a single field, if they advanced at all, were now crossing multiple hedgerows in minutes. The Germans were caught completely off guard, their defensive doctrine rendered obsolete in an instant. For weeks they had prepared for American tanks to climb over the hedgerows, exposing their vulnerable bellies, and had positioned their Panzerfaust teams and anti-tank guns to target that exact spot. But the Rhino tanks didn't climb. They punched straight through the base of the hedgerows, moving at ground level, and the German firing positions, set up to target the top of the barriers, were now useless. The enemy gunners, confused and disoriented, fired wildly, their rounds missing the tanks or bouncing harmlessly off the hulls. The Allied advance was finally unstoppable. By 10:30 a.m., just 3 hours after the assault began, the 2nd Armored Division had advanced 2 miles, a distance that had taken 3 full days of bloody fighting just a week earlier. The 3rd Armored Division reported similar progress, their tanks tearing through the hedgerows with ease. The German hedgerow defensive network, once thought to be impenetrable, was collapsing rapidly as the terrain's tactical advantage disappeared. What had stopped American tanks for 6 long weeks now delayed them by just 15 seconds per hedgerow. Of course, the devices weren't perfect, and reports of failures began to trickle in around 11 a.m. A Sherman from the 741st Tank Battalion had hit a hedgerow with a hidden stone foundation, the solid rock causing the prongs to bend backward on impact. The tank was stuck, unable to move forward or reverse, and the crew was forced to abandon it under heavy machine gun fire. 2 men were killed as they tried to escape, their bodies falling in the dirt near the immobilized tank. Another failure came at 11:20 a.m. A light tank's prongs broke off completely when they struck an iron fence post hidden deep in the base of a hedgerow, the unexpected obstacle shearing the steel cleanly. The tank commander reported that the device had ripped away, taking part of the bow plate with it, leaving the tank combat effective but unable to breach any more hedgerows. A 3rd failure occurred at noon. A tank destroyer equipped with railroad prongs had hit a hedge at 30 miles per hour, faster than the recommended 25 miles per hour, and the impact had buckled the mounting brackets, causing the prongs to twist sideways and jam the tank's right track. The vehicle was immobilized, left sitting in the open. The failure rate, after compiling all the reports, was approximately 4%. 4 failed breaches out of every 100 attempts. It was not catastrophic, but it was significant. 4% of 2,300 tanks meant 92 devices would fail during Operation Cobra, 92 crews potentially trapped in open fields with German guns targeting them. But when compared to the alternative, 60% casualties from exposed belly armor, it was a small price to pay. The Rhino tanks were saving lives by the hundreds. By 1:30 p.m., a radio report came through that changed everything, a message that sent a wave of relief through Bradley's headquarters in the forward observation post. A battalion from the 3rd Armored Division had reached the Marigny-St. Gilles Road, 4 miles inland, a distance that had taken 2 grueling weeks to cover in June. By 3 p.m., advance elements of the division were 5 miles inland, their tanks pushing deeper into France as German units fell back in disarray, unable to establish new defensive lines fast enough. The hedgerow terrain that had protected the Germans for weeks was now working against them, slowing their retreat and leaving them vulnerable to Allied attacks. At 4:15 p.m., Bradley's headquarters issued an official assessment. Operation Cobra was succeeding beyond all projections, the Rhino tanks having solved the hedgerow problem once and for all. Estimated German casualties were 3 times higher than American losses, and the stalemate that had plagued the Normandy campaign for 6 weeks was finally broken. Cullen left the observation post at 5 p.m., driving back toward the production site at Colombelle, his mind still reeling from the day's events. The welding stations were abandoned now, all the tanks having moved forward to the front lines, and the field was empty except for piles of cut steel scraps, burnt-out torch tips, and the faint smell of hot metal. He climbed out of his Jeep and sat on the hood, staring out at the empty field, trying to process what had happened. Just 3 weeks earlier, he had sketched his idea on a ration box, using enemy beach obstacles as raw material. Now the entire Normandy front was moving, the Allied breakout underway, because tanks could punch through hedgerows instead of climbing over them. The 4% failure rate still bothered him, a reminder that his design wasn't perfect. Stone foundations, hidden fence posts, excessive speed, variables he hadn't been able to test in the rush to build the devices. 92 crews were paying the price for those gaps in his testing, but 2,200 devices had worked. 14,000 men were advancing through terrain that should have killed them. The math was brutal, but it was clear. 4% failure was infinitely better than 60% casualties. As the sun set over Normandy, painting the sky orange and pink, Cullen could hear the distant rumble of artillery fire, a sound that meant the front had moved 8 miles inland that day. 8 miles in one day, after weeks of barely moving at all. The hedgerow nightmare was behind them now. In the days that followed Operation Cobra's successful launch, Bradley issued new orders for the production of additional hedge cutters. As Allied units advanced beyond the main hedgerow country, they encountered scattered hedge lines in interior France, and the Rhino tank's prongs remained useful for clearing these smaller obstacles. The Ordnance Group received authorization to produce another 500 units, using the remaining railroad steel stockpiled at Colombelle. By July 28th, just 3 days after Cobra began, the total production count had reached 2,850 modified tanks, approximately 60% of First Army's armored vehicles. The remaining 40% were specialized vehicles, like tank destroyers with limited hull space that couldn't mount the prongs, or units held in reserve for future operations. The geographic spread of the Rhino tanks was remarkable. The 2nd Armored Division used them to advance from Saint-Lô to Coutances. The 3rd Armored Division employed them in their push from Marigny to Avranches. The 1st Infantry Division deployed them during the Mortagne counterattack, when German forces launched a desperate counteroffensive to halt the Allied breakout. And the 4th Armored Division received their prongs on July 30th, using them to advance rapidly toward Brittany. Different units adapted the basic design to suit their needs. The 747th Tank Battalion, led by Lieutenant Green, preferred the heavy railroad prongs, finding them more durable in rough terrain. The 2nd Armored Division standardized on Cullen's lighter Hedgehog steel version, which was easier to install and didn't put as much strain on the tank's suspension. Some tank destroyer units welded shorter 3-prong variants to their hulls, preserving the traverse of their main guns, and light tank crews used 2-prong versions to reduce weight and improve maneuverability. Maintenance units working in the field under combat conditions developed quick repair procedures for damaged prongs. Bent prongs could be straightened with hydraulic jacks, broken welds could be rewelded in 30 minutes, and completely destroyed devices could be replaced in 2 hours if spare prongs were available. The production site at Colombelle was converted into a repair depot, processing damaged devices and returning them to service as quickly as possible. Intelligence reports from captured German officers revealed the fear that the Rhino tanks had inspired. They called the devices hedge devils, or iron tusks, names that reflected the terror they felt when seeing the tanks punch through hedgerows they thought were impregnable. Several prisoners stated that they had abandoned their defensive positions as soon as they realized American tanks could breach any hedgerow, knowing their anti-tank weapons were useless. One German company commander, captured near Avranches, reported that his entire anti-tank gun crew had fled in panic after watching 3 Shermans punch through a hedge line they had spent weeks fortifying. By August 5th, just 11 days after Operation Cobra launched, the hedgerow campaign was effectively over. American forces had broken through into the open French countryside, where their tanks could move freely, unhindered by the earthen barriers that had slowed them for so long. The hedgerow problem that had stopped the First Army for 6 weeks had been solved in just 12 days of frantic production and innovation. Bradley's staff, after compiling the data from the campaign, calculated that the Rhino tanks had accelerated the Allied breakout by approximately 4 to 6 weeks, a critical advantage that allowed the Allies to push deep into France before the German army could regroup. The statistical impact was staggering. Between July 25th and August 10th, American tank casualties dropped by 37% compared to the months of June and early July. This represented approximately 300 tanks that were not destroyed and 1,500 crew members who were not killed or wounded. Lives saved directly because of Cullen's invention. The 4% device failure rate was negligible when compared to this massive reduction in casualties. The devices were still in use on September 2, 1944, when American forces liberated Paris, a moment of triumph for the Allies. A few Rhino tanks even participated in the liberation parade down the Champs-Élysées, their steel prongs still visible on their bow plates. French civilians, watching the parade, didn't know what the strange metal tusks meant, but the American tankers who drove them knew. Those prongs represented the difference between dying in a Norman field and marching into Paris as liberators. On August 20th, a formal ceremony was held at a field near St. Lo to honor Cullen for his invention. Bradley personally pinned the Legion of Merit, the U.S. military's fourth highest decoration, to Cullen's uniform. The device was officially designated the Cullen Hedge Cutting Device M1 in Army records, ensuring that Cullen's name would be forever linked to the solution that broke the Normandy stalemate. In 1951, General Omar Bradley published his memoir, A Soldier's Story. In the book, Bradley dedicated detailed passages to the hedgerow problem and Cullen's solution, describing the device as so absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. He credited Cullen by name, recalling the July 13th demonstration near St. Lo and the impact the invention had on Operation Cobra. Bradley's memoir was a bestseller, and it brought renewed attention to Cullen's innovation. Military historians began citing the Cullen device as a classic example of how field improvisation could solve strategic problems that had stumped high command. The actual Rhino tank devices, however, mostly disappeared after the war. A few were preserved in military museums. The Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky, displayed a Sherman tank with the original Cullen hedgehog prongs, while the National World War II Museum in New Orleans later acquired a similar example. But most of the 2,850 devices were scrapped for their steel or lost to the ravages of time. Their job done. Curtis Cullen died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, at the age of 48. The cause of death was a heart attack, likely exacerbated by the stress and physical toll of his wartime service. Obituaries in local newspapers mentioned his Legion of Merit and his role in developing the hedgerow cutter, but the notices were brief, buried among other local news. Few people outside military history circles remembered his innovation or its significance. 1 year later, however, something unexpected happened. Something that would ensure Cullen's name and contribution would never be forgotten. On the 20th anniversary of D-Day, June 6, 1964, former President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had served as Supreme Allied Commander during World War II, gave a television interview to CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite. Cronkite asked Eisenhower about the challenges of the Normandy campaign, specifically mentioning the hedgerow problem. Eisenhower, his voice steady and authoritative, told the story of the hedgerow cutter, naming Cullen specifically and explaining in detail how the device had changed the course of the campaign. The interview aired nationwide on CBS, reaching millions of American households. Eisenhower's endorsement, delivered on national television by a revered military leader and former president, transformed the hedgerow cutter from a historical footnote into a legend. Cullen wasn't alive to see it, but his contribution finally received the national recognition it deserved. The interview footage was filmed on location in Normandy's hedgerow country, with Eisenhower standing in a field near St. Lo, pointing out the exact spot where Cullen's original demonstration had taken place 20 years earlier. The hedgerows were still there, still 12 feet tall, still formidable obstacles, and Eisenhower used them to illustrate just how daunting the challenge had been, and just how brilliant Cullen's solution was. That sergeant, Eisenhower told Cronkite, solved a problem that had stumped an entire army. He didn't have fancy equipment or a big budget. He just had ingenuity and courage. And because of him, thousands of American boys came home alive. If this story moved you, hit that like button. Every like tells YouTube to share this forgotten hero story with more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing stories of ordinary soldiers who saved lives with courage and ingenuity every week. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? Does your family have a World War II service story? Let us know. You're helping keep these memories alive. Thank you for watching and for ensuring Curtis Cullen's contribution is never forgotten.